One of the things that we say, those of us who work in Old Parliament House, including those at the Howard Library, is that there's not too many things for which you can't blame Edmund Barton. In other words, Commonwealth-state relations, well, I suppose it's not surprising, it's almost inevitable that they influence so many things that we do in our country. Now, this afternoon we're going to hear, in a slightly different version, Kate Carnell, the former Chief Minister of the Australian Capital Territory, talk to us about Commonwealth-state relations. Kate was unable to be with us right now, but you'll see her on the film, and I'll throw to that directly. Thank you. Okay, Carnell, welcome to the Howard Library and the 4th Howard Government Retrospective Conference. Thanks for joining us.
It's an absolute pleasure, and I'm sitting in John's chair. How exciting is that?
And people actually tell us it's not that comfortable. I'm not sure how you're finding it. We'll be here for a little while, but...
Well, I have to say, I wouldn't choose this one to sit in for terribly long, but that could be because I'm a bit short.
Well, you were elected the ACT Chief Minister in March of 1995, making you the first Liberal woman elected as either Chief Minister or Premier in Australian history. Now, just the next month, you attended a CoAG meeting with Paul Keating as the Prime Minister. Yes. What do you recall of that meeting, both interactions with the Prime Minister, but also the other state premiers?
Look, it was an interesting meeting because remember there was the majority of states and territories had Liberal, premiers and chief ministers back in those days, but it was an interesting meeting because it was the competition policy CoAG, and lots of work had been done over a long period of time to get states and territories together and to actually sign the competition policy agreement, even though legislation had floated around for a while and so on. So it was quite an exciting meeting from that perspective because we did all sign, both Labor and Liberal states and territories, an agreement with 3 documents that underpinned a lot of economic reform, particularly in the competition policy space and in the ACCC space. So there was a level of excitement in that arena. But the other things that were on the agenda were all the things that had been on the agenda for a long time. Health reform, public housing reform, those sorts of issues. And they really, in my view, had stalled by that stage. So exciting about competition policy because it was a major reform. And I'd have to say, it's something that Paul Keating should be incredibly proud of. Part of it, of course, though, was a significant package of some people would say bribery for the states and territories. There was competition policy payments, and that was a bit of an incentive for lots of premiers. But it made a difference. So it was an exciting meeting. But you did get a sense of, what was the next? What else did they have on the agenda really? And there was, didn't seem to be a lot.
Now, in terms of the relationships at that time between the Commonwealth and the states, and perhaps between the states, did you come to that first meeting, or did you have your own thoughts separately that Commonwealth-state relations needed to be reformed, repaired in some way?
Look, absolutely. And that meeting certainly didn't change those views. The dilemmas of the Commonwealth Grants Commission approach, fundamentally, the states spending a very large amount of time to try to convince the federal government that they should get a bigger bit of the pot, is a pretty unfortunate scenario. I remember at one stage my team in the little old ACT, I had, I think, 4 people working on the ACT the ACT submission to the Commonwealth Grants Commission to determine how much of the pot the ACT got, and they were telling me that there's a whole floor in New South Wales of people working on the same scenario. So, the dilemma with how money was carved up was very real. But the other things that really needed to change was that the Commonwealth and state, the level of duplication was significant. Efficiencies that could be achieved by together being able, with Commonwealth and state together, being able to address a range of issues had started to be done but had a long way to go. And it was great to see the Howard government really address a lot of micro-reform issues in a lot of different areas, and right from environmental issues to gas reform to water, a whole range of things we're still talking about, by the way, quite early on.
Did it make, though, much of a difference that you were a Liberal leader with a Labor Prime Minister, or did Paul Keating regard the ACT as not a jurisdiction that he had to be too worried about because he presumed that it would come back to Labor at the next election?
Look, I think that's probably the truth. I think the ACT has usually been taken for granted by both sides for the exact opposite reason. The Libs, because they don't think they can win it. We proved you could. And the Labor Party, because they don't think they can lose it. And we proved that they could lose it. Look, the fascinating bit about dealing with excuse me, with Paul Keating was that, we did have a chat, at that meeting. He did pull me into his room and say, first meeting, here are the sorts of things I'd like to achieve at this meeting, is there anything you want to have? And so he was really very pleasant. Mind you, I was his local pharmacist, so that really did break through a few barriers. And I'd have to say, one of the things I think that Canberra should be very, pleased about what Paul Keating did is, I still remember the day Paul Keating rang me directly in my office and said, Kate, can we do a land swap? And I said, well, I think our people have been talking about some issues. He said, yeah, what I'd like to do is I'd like the hospital site. I will give you Kingston Foreshore, we'll do the deal. And I said, sounds good to me. He said, fine, deal done. Hung up.
And that was it?
That was it. Oh, we've just done the deal for the National Museum to go ahead on the old hospital site, and for Kingston Foreshore to go into planning stage for what we see today, which, is a damn side better than falling down, a whole lot of falling down old buildings, which was what Kingston Foreshore was. It's now a really vibrant hub, for Canberra as a great place to live. So, Paul was able to make decisions, one might say, and do it reasonably quickly. So
you had high hopes when the coalition was elected in March of 1996 and John Howard as Prime Minister?
Look, my background is small business, always has been, and the reason I went into politics is I think small to medium businesses in Australia need a better go, and so the sort of policy direction that we were taking the ACT and that the Howard government embraced was the reason I was in politics. So it was great to hear the Howard government talk about areas like balancing budgets, economic growth, industrial relations reform, getting rid of red tape, a range of those sort of, basic sorts of things that business need, particularly smaller business need to grow their businesses and to employ people and for us to really get economic growth happening. So for me, this was pretty exciting.
Did you get a sense at that first meeting, though, that the Howard government had an agenda for Commonwealth-state relations?
Look, there is no doubt that the Howard government approached Commonwealth-state relations very, very differently from the Labor Party. That said, that I as I've said, I found Keating and Hawke really quite reasonable to deal with. But the Howard government really did have an approach with the states, which was about how if we work together we can achieve great things. That it was a more of a collaborative approach, and I think that was part of quite major microeconomic reforms that were made in those first years of the Howard government, and the states I think felt very much part of it, and that's really important.
Did you get a sense, though, that they'd had their, in one sense, first big CoAG activity with gun reform?
Yeah.
with the National Firearms Agreement, that things were achieved that perhaps people didn't think were possible. Do you think that made the Howard government more ambitious than it might have been had that tragedy not occurred and that reform been made?
Look, I think so, because let's be fair, it was major. You know, bringing the National Party on board with something like that was pretty tough, and you know, a large number of Australians, you know, found that change really difficult. But the Howard government managed to do it, and managed to do it in a very collegiate sort of a way, which showed what was possible. And I think, you know, let's be fair, things went on from there in a range of different areas to achieve industrial relations reform, to achieve environmental reform. You know, coming up with with the environmental bill that brought together lots of other, you know, little bills at both state and federal levels. Those sorts of things were major pieces of reform, and it was great to see, you know, that really being embraced. And of course, maybe, you know, that was part of having the capacity to pull off the GST, you know, actual tax reform. And we haven't really had too much tax reform since then.
No, but it must have been when the first budget was brought down and there'd be a freeze in the public service, there'd be a different approach, that this fell disproportionately on Canberra. Yep. Did you think then that the Howard government, again, was either indifferent to your jurisdiction because it'll go back to Labor at the next election, or that Canberra wasn't a part of the Commonwealth, that the Commonwealth itself needed to pay much attention to?
Look, I certainly don't think there was too much focus on the impact on Canberra of some of the policies in that 1996 budget, which really did reduce expenditure quite a lot, and it did what the government was elected to do, and that's to balance the budget to address the $10 billion deficit. So they were doing what they said they'd do. Now the problem was that the impact upon Canberra was extraordinary, because it was really quite quick. We lost something like 15,000 public servants, over what was a very short period of time. And I remember the Canberra Times running front page sort of pictures of there being a traffic jam of removal vehicles, running down Northbourne Avenue. The ACT ended up with 3 consecutive quarters of negative growth. It's always fun just after you've taken over as the first Liberal in that space. And of course, John Howard chose not to live in Canberra. And that might not seem important, but it was really important to Canberrans at the time. So it did feel like we'd been a bit abandoned. What happened was Canberrans sort of pulled together, and we went from those 3 consecutive quarters of negative growth, read recession if you want to get into those sort of definitions, into having the highest growth rate in Australia in 3 years. And what happened is Canberrans all of a sudden thought, well, we shouldn't be reliant on the federal government. We can do this ourselves. We ended up with the majority of Canberrans working in the private sector. We ended up with extraordinary community, I suppose, gutsy behaviour to really pull the ACT out of a mire.
So did you win an unwinnable election that followed all of this? Did you think it was winnable or unwinnable?
I thought it was going to be pretty hard to win in '98 because we had the issue of the hospital implosion at the time, which was, of course, part of the land swap as well, and that was a very real issue, probably the worst day of my life, I'd have to say. So we'd had a number of issues along those lines, but we won that election quite easily. So I think the fact is Canberra wanted to set its own destiny. It had really hadn't enjoyed what had happened, but it had showed that Canberra had come of age.
So do Commonwealth-state relations have any kind of political cargo here in the ACT?
Commonwealth-state relations were always difficult because, as I said, you know, no federal government ever thinks we're terribly important, because, you know, we're either the Libs think we can't win the ACT, the Libs can't win the ACT, the Labor Party think they can't lose, so you'd have to look after Canberra terribly much. So we had to work really hard on Commonwealth state relations. On the positive side, a lot of public servants who are involved in Commonwealth state relations live in the ACT. So there's you've got to look on the glass half full approach to this. I have to tell you though, some of the funniest bits of Commonwealth state relations was Jeff Kennett and Bob Carr, almost with their arms around each other, you know, trying to convince John Howard and Peter Costello that they should allocate significantly, they should allocate money to the states based upon population. And, you know, all of this business of, you know, giving all of this money to the Northern Territory and Tasmania was totally inappropriate, and so there was some somewhat amusing moments when people who you wouldn't have thought were on the same page tried to sell the absolute unsaleable proposition to John Howard.
So is it the case that, in your experience, that political loyalties, but also state aspirations, actually cut across each other, and that in the case of, say, Jeff Kennett on your side of politics, that didn't count for anything? If you get, you know, the old statement, don't get in the way of a premier and a bucket of dollar, a bucket of money. Yeah. That was your experience? Oh,
absolutely. You know, I think where that became even more sort of front and centre was during the GST debate, because the Labor states, of course, didn't supposedly support the GST at all, except that in CoAG, I think if you look back at the CoAG communique at that stage, the three Labor states, or states and territories at the time, said, notwithstanding the fact that we don't actually support the GST, we are really positive about the carving up of the money. You know, that sort of approach. So they were more than happy to have in-depth discussions about, you know, who got which bits of the dollars and how that was done. They just wanted to have up front that they didn't really support it to start with. And that's very much the way it works.
Now, you mentioned the Northern Territory, and we had very early in the life of the Howard government the overriding of voluntary euthanasia laws in the Northern Territory. Was that for you an indicator that either the ACT and the Northern Territory should be states, or that Commonwealth state relations needed to somehow be reformed, particularly on social matters?
Look, absolutely, and this was a territory issue, obviously, because the Commonwealth could override territory legislation, and I think that just needs to change. I can't believe it hasn't changed.
Do you think that's wrong, that the Commonwealth can do that?
Absolutely wrong. I think the Commonwealth should have the right to legislate or to step in where national security is in play. But where the people of the Northern Territory or the ACT have elected a government to run the territories, then they should be able to do it. And it certainly wasn't as if Marshall Perrin had ever been. This was a surprise, you know, in terms of his views on this. And it's certainly not the case that the Northern Territory, there was any views that the people of the Northern Territory didn't support the government's view on voluntary euthanasia. It was a bit similar for us when we were trying to run the heroin trial in the ACT, and the federal government said that they would stop us importing the heroin. So we could run it, but we couldn't get the heroin, so that was the end of that. And I think that's when the federal government should really opt out of territory territory affairs, where it's not about national security, where they're not national issues, they're issues that should be able to be addressed.
Did you feel, though, the Howard government on that point was more philosophically or politically inclined to say you can't do what you say you want to do?
Look, absolutely. I fully accept that the Howard government had some fairly conservative views on things like drug law reform or voluntary euthanasia, but they're certainly not core issues for Liberal Party philosophy, at least in my view, and they're certainly not core issues that the Howard government stood for election on. So if the Northern Territory government at the time wanted to, and they did want to legislate on voluntary euthanasia, then they should have every right to do so, as the ACT should have the right to do what it chooses to do in terms of areas like drug law reform. We've got some similar issues happening in the ACT right now, with the legalisation of marijuana, and I think that it's really important to let the elected governments run their territories the way they think they should.
So is it contrary, in your understanding of Liberal Party philosophy, for government to be intrusive in the ways in which you think it's been intrusive of the Commonwealth with respect to the states and the territories?
I think it's totally at odds with Liberal Party philosophy. The Liberal Party have always believed that the states had a very important role in the Federation, and that they had a rights and obligations to run their own deals. Really, that's been the basis of coalition type policy in this space. It's not the same to say you can run your own deal as long as you don't upset us, or as long as we agree with you. That's not how it should work, and I think it's important that changes.
And in the 5.5 years that you were Chief Minister and then there was the Howard government, in terms of the big areas of funding, education and health, were there changes made that were beneficial to the ACT and perhaps also the Northern Territory and the states in the way that funding was distributed?
Look, absolutely. I think the health reforms that were done over particularly the first 5 years of the Howard government, and I'm not saying the next ones were good too, but there was quite significant changes during those times in what the focus on health was, and the cost allocations around health. That was sort of a move away from systems to outcomes based funding, and of course a focus on private health insurance and making sure that we had pricing systems or costing systems in the health scenario that reflected best practice, not just reflected what we've always done before. It was a much more focused approach to funding in the space, and of course the work that Michael Wooldridge did in things like immunisation rates and so on was really quite stunning, taking into account that that immunisation is a service delivery issue predominantly, and so a lot of it required the states and territories to be absolutely on board. So it was important that the Commonwealth worked really closely with the states to stop what was truly stupid behaviour, and that was the level of cost shifting that was going on between the Commonwealth and the states was significant. Still is to some extent, but the Commonwealth, the Howard government addressed that with multilateral agreements that included the PBS and the MBS, uncapped programs funded by the Commonwealth, along with states and a range of the preventative and primary healthcare stuff. So it brought it all together, at least to the extent that it could be at the time, and that was a step in the right direction with a focus on outcomes, not just inputs. Now, that's important stuff.
And did that therefore mean, with that emphasis, there was less likelihood or less capacity for the Commonwealth to engage in state-based pork barrelling, in other words, favouring those of its party and damaging those who weren't?
Look, absolutely, because you couldn't do it under those sort of agreements. The payment was for actual activity and outcomes in the system, not for we'll just give Queensland a whole lot more money or someone else a whole lot more money. So it was the funding was really quite tied to outcomes and to quality as well, and that's been an area where it's been harder to nail, really, but they gave it a good shot.
Who, in your sort of recollection of the period, Who was driving changes to Commonwealth-state relations? Was it John Howard? Was it Peter Costello because he was paying the money? Was it the Attorney General? Did you get a sense of where the impetus came from within the Howard cabinet to really make some progress in this area?
Look, I think it was Peter Costello and Treasury, generally because they paid the money, and Commonwealth state relations were fraught. It was actually quite funny. There was the obligatory walkout of the premiers. When there was, was CoAG and premiers conferences. The premiers conferences were when we talked about money. They ended up being CoAG meetings, but there was the money bit. The premiers, by the nature of it, had to walk out and have a dummy spit, and then there had to be more negotiations, and then you had to walk back in, and it was all a bit silly, really. But it's absolutely true that the role of the premiers and the chief ministers was to get the best deal for their jurisdiction, and so that created a level of tension.
And in terms of being here in the ACT, surrounded by a state government, did you feel there were some things the Commonwealth might have done to actually improve relations between states and between the states and the territories?
Look, some of the things that are really hard from a small state or a territory perspective is the level of competition that exists between states and territories. In other words, the sort of amounts of money that can be thrown at projects, can be thrown at tourism, ranges of things, to help grow the state budget. So the dilemma we had, being right in the middle of New South Wales, is a whole range of New South Wales people used ACT services, hospitals, libraries, schools, you name it, because a lot of them work in Canberra. And even the ones that don't work in Canberra, Canberra was the closest centre. So the dilemma for us was we had to negotiate directly with New South Wales to try to get New South Wales to pay a reasonable amount of money for the services their people were using from us. Now, I tell you what, we didn't have a whole lot of bargaining power because we didn't have a capacity to at the border to say, "Oh, you're from New South Wales, you go back, you can't use our services." So there's issues like that fundamentally don't work very well, and the federal government could have significantly helped us in that space. The other issue is that most services cost more in the ACT because we don't have economies of scale, and New South Wales's approach was, look, we'll pay you what it costs us at the lower end of the scale to look after all of our people. That wasn't terribly fair or reasonable, but the Commonwealth doesn't takes its hands off, or did in those days. That's a matter for you guys. You fix it.
So after 2000, you pursued a new career in the private sector, leading several industry associations. How did you come to view, as an outsider, Commonwealth-state relations in the last half of the Howard government? Did they do better then, or was it more of the same from what you observed as an outsider?
As an outsider, I found that the level of consultation went down. I found it increasingly difficult to be in the, involved in the early stage of policy development. I think this happens to lots of governments that have been around for a long time, and during that time I ran the National Association of Forest Industries. In fact, we organised that famous famous meeting in Launceston with the Prime Minister and the truckies, which many people would say helped John Howard win that election.
The CFMEU found a new hero.
They did. The CFMEU were there, and
were you conscious of that at the time, that this was going to give him a political bounce?
We thought it would, but we thought it would only in Tassie. We thought it'd work like a charm in Launceston, because remember Michael O'Connor was on stage with the Prime Minister at that rally, and there were all those big buffy blokes in blue t-shirts and hats, and John with the shirt sleeves up, and it was a beautiful piece beautiful photos from a political perspective, but it really mattered to those people. That it was their jobs, it was their livelihood that was being really impacted upon by policies that were killing the forest industries in Tasmania and, by the way, in other parts of Australia. So, it mattered to a lot of people, but the visuals were pretty impressive.
But the Howard government, you thought, was at that stage, though, consulting less.
That stage, that was sort of the early 2000s. We were good then. By the time I was with the Australian Food and Grocery Council, which were the food manufacturers, we struggled a bit more. Not totally, but after that, it was it just got harder to be involved in policy development, and that's what industry associations want to be. It's what their members want them to be. It's what they exist for, really, to be able to have input in the early days, not just when the consultation paper comes out, which is really the final piece of work. So I think that there was less of that towards the end of the Howard government, and during the beginning part it was great.
Does it seem, though, when you're an outsider, that a lot of this Commonwealth state stuff is either stopping Canberra intervening or resisting the power of New South Wales?
Look, I think the whole issue of Commonwealth state relations and the whole CoAG agenda has got way out of control, because I don't think there's not a logical way, or not an easy way, particularly for business or the community generally, to input into the system at all. CoAG now, is a bureaucracy unto itself. It didn't start that way, of course, but it is now, and it's become more of a barrier for business and others to input into policy development generally, because it's in CoAG, this amorphous thing called CoAG, rather than in state or federal ministers' offices even. And that's, I think, is something that really needs to be addressed a bit, and really hasn't been, because the issue around bureaucracies, and CoAG is one of them, is they tend to grow unless you stop them growing.
And if you were to give the Howard government a score out of 10 for its performance in Commonwealth state relations, would you have to separate out the first 5 years from the second 6 years? Do you see it that way, or could you give them a mark for the whole period?
Well, look, for me, I saw it up close and personal for the first 5 years, of course, and then from a bit of a distance after that. So it's a bit hard to give them a score. But I think the thing that was different about the Howard government is it actually valued the states and the territories. I didn't see them as a bit of an impediment to the whole approach to government. Because if you remember, I think it was Whitlam who suggested that the states should really go, and we should go to regional government and so on. And there's certain positives of that, but the Howard government did value the input of the states, but it was still always a bit of a battle. That the dollars were always the issue. It's and I suppose still is. So what's the answer here? It's an interesting question, and I suppose what is the answer is where things really go wrong is where the Commonwealth and the states are involved in parts of the same thing, and health's one of them, where the states run hospitals.
Is it unclear?
It is clear what the states run and what the federal government runs, but the issue of where the money sits is where the challenge is. So, if I go into a hospital, the ACT government or the New South Wales government is paying, shall we say. If I'm discharged and I go to my local GP, then the federal government's paying. If I get a script, the federal government's paying. But if I got the script in the hospital when I was there, the state government is paying. And so there's still a chunk of that stuff that's a real issue for Commonwealth state relations. as is a range of things around educational and vocational training. You know, the interface between vocational training and the education systems, which are owned by the states, is a difficult one, and continues to be so. So, you know, this is not a simple space, but I think if I gave the Howard government, I suppose, a mark, I'd be giving them 7 out of 10, because they valued the states, they worked with the states. There was a range of changes that really did streamline Commonwealth-state relations, and certainly streamlined the way business interfaced with government.
On that sanguine note, we'll leave it there. Kate Carnell, thanks for your time.
Thanks very much.